Hello, lovers of the world. This is Sinta speaking. I love reading mystery novels, so I picked out this book from the library called The Guggenheim Mystery, written by Robin Stevens. The Guggenheim Mystery is a middle grade story, and it actually follows as a sequel to this other novel called The London Eye Mystery, and it was written by somebody else, but they had passed away, so Robin Stevens took up the mantle and finished the story for them, I think that's how it went. Anyway, this story is about Ted Sparks, who is the protagonist from The London Eye Mystery, now in New York. He is on a vacation with his sister, Kat, and his mom to visit their aunt, Gloria, and their cousin, Salim. Their aunt works at the Guggenheim Mystery in New York, and they have been sort of settling down there, and they're kind of acting as like the tour guides for not just for Ted and his family, but also for us, the readers. On the day that they visit the Guggenheim Museum, a priceless painting was stolen during this fake fire alarm at the museum, and somebody is framing Aunt Gloria. So it is up to our three detectives, Ted, Kat, and Salim, to prove her innocence and find out what really happened to that priceless painting. That's basically the gist of the story itself, and I will be talking about how I feel about this book. And so this video is not a spoiler-free zone because I wanted to talk very candidly about my opinions about this novel. So I guess without further ado, let's just get right into this review. Because the book itself is middle grade, it is definitely below my reading level, and so I don't really think it's fair for me to critique it in the same way that I would critique other mystery novels that I've read in the past, because usually I'd be very harsh about them because I know exactly what I like and how I want the mystery to be done. So it's not really fair for me to, I guess, see this novel with the same lens. And so I'm gonna be very forgiving about it in this. Obviously, to be fair, the mystery itself is quite good for its target audience. I do remember trying to read The London Eye Mystery a long time ago, but I never got to finish it, so I don't really know how this novel fits in with that previous novel. So a lot of this is kind of just like my own opinions, and entirely my opinions based on this novel as if it was standalone. Luckily, if you are a reader who hasn't read The London Eye Mystery yet, it's actually quite good for like reading it as a standalone novel. Like it kind of gives you like the necessary information for you to follow along the story. Obviously, they make references to what happened in the previous novel, in which Salim went missing for like a few days. But I think if you just read the synopsis of the London Eye Mystery, you will kind of understand what they're talking about. So I would say you don't have to read the London Eye Mystery to read this, but it would probably help. It's good for kids who are beginning to read because the mystery is quite good at giving you enough to be able to follow along in terms of like detecting and investigating, but it also isn't complex enough for them to be caught up in the logistics of it. I think for me as an adult reading this middle grade story, I did find myself being like, it's not a bit realistic in it. And that's kind of like how I felt about reading something that was below my reading level in general anyway. But yeah, the plot itself is quite mundane. As I said, the plot mostly revolves around them interviewing various suspects on a very surface level as they go through different parts of the city. It would have been a very tedious read if not for how the story also weaves in the element of Ted's neurodivergence. And I think Ted is a very nice character. Because he is on the autism spectrum, his perspective is obviously new, I guess, depending on what kind of books you read, I suppose. But you know, not a lot of mainstream books, not a lot of popular books feature a lot about, I guess, people on the spectrum. I was quite impressed that this book tackled it in a very careful way. I think his internal monologue is also very fascinating and rich, and I really love his hyperfixation with the weather and the way that he weaves in this story about Odysseus with his own journey as he navigates this unfamiliar place of New York City. And I think it's also interesting because Ted doesn't like changes in routine. It is something that he finds difficult to grasp. But the fact that he likes weather, which is one of the most unpredictable things in this universe, is quite an interesting, I guess, like foil almost. Like the way it's almost like a way for him to understand how complex the world is with science. So I thought that was quite cool. And I also like that he wasn't written in a way that played into the negative stereotypes of people on the autism spectrum. Of course, the general thing about like not having a lot of social awareness or taking things too literally is there, but his symptoms are not really presented as a barrier or flaws, but they're just laid out openly and plainly for the reader to see. And I think it helps that it's us reading his internal monologue. So it's kind of like we're inside his head and we can see how confused he is at certain things. And we feel more sympathetic with him because of that. And I think it helped that a lot of his own confusion stems from the general nuance of being a human being in society anyway. Lots of stuff about all of it is stuff that we as human beings would want, like things that we want to say out loud, but we know we can't because of social conventions. It helps paint him more sympathetically because we're like, oh, I understand why you're confused by this. And you're right. It is weird that we have all these barriers that prevent us from being and saying what we really feel and think. I also like that his symptoms weren't like glamorized as like a superpower or anything. Like he doesn't have like superhuman memory, because there is definitely the danger of like romanticizing it and such, which is like the flip side of negative stereotypes, I guess. It's just the balance of trying to be as accurate as you can to the experience of being on the autism spectrum, if that makes sense. And I like that his, I guess, quirks are just so happen to help him in his investigations. They're not like it's not like they're not like, oh, you're superhuman, or they're not putting him on a pedestal. They just see his symptoms as a part of himself that so happen to help them in other lives. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, Ted is just a very endearing character anyway, because the way that he stims and the way that he like acts out externally is very similar to my own brother who is on the autism spectrum. Like the handshaking and the vocal noises when he's stressed out. Another memorable part in the story for me is when Ted gets separated from Kat and Salim and he heads to Times Square by himself, and he has this like really interesting and very colorful internal monologue about why that painting might be stolen. It's like a moment of character growth for him, because in the beginning he was confused as to why people would want to steal paintings and stuff like that. But now that he's by himself, now that he has the time to actually think about these things, he reaches the conclusion that he needs to have for him to solve that mystery. So I thought that was cool. That was probably my favorite piece of writing from the entire novel. I also think that the way that the novel handles Ted's neurodivergence and how it affects other people is quite good. And you can tell that the people around him can be a bit annoyed by him, which is honestly very realistic. But they also treat him with respect. Like, you can tell that his mom, his dad, even his sister care, and Salim cares for him. And it just shows that that Ted has a good support system, even though it has its own ups and downs. You can tell that he is cared for and loved for. And I just thought that was quite wholesome. I find that like autism spectrum representation can be a bit tricky, and it's just nice to see something a little bit more flawed but positive in a story. I didn't read the first book, like I said, so I'm not entirely sure how prominent the relationship Ted has with his father in that first book, but I also thought it was quite sweet in the beginning where Ted relied heavily on his dad to explain what figures of speech meant, because he struggles with that kind of stuff. So again, I thought that was quite cute. Speaking of family members, I also really like the part where Kat, in the beginning or earlier in the novel, she breaks down in tears because she's upset that she has to be more mature, or that her problems are shoved aside in favor of Ted because Ted has autism and her parents expect her to take care of him, but also they don't have a lot of emotional or mental like time or capacity to worry about Kat as well. So she's quite frustrated that, you know, she wants to be the center of attention sometimes. Like she feels like she has to fight for her parents' like, you know, attention in that way because all of it is towards Ted and making sure that his life is okay. But Kat, obviously, she wants to have her own life and she wants people to care about her too. And she feels frustrated and confused at the idea that she has to, like, obviously conflicted about wanting a bit of the spotlight for herself as well. I just thought it was quite thoughtful of the writer to include because it's something that I kind of relate to very viscerally as a person having an autistic brother as well. The writer did it in a way that did acknowledge Kat's own feelings, but also did it in a way that didn't paint Ted as like a bad guy because as Ted said so multiple times in a novel himself, he can't help the way that he is. And Kat acknowledges that and knows that, and I think that's part of the struggle with or having an autistic family member anyway. Like knowing that this is something that they can't help but be or do, but it's something that you wish that they wouldn't, I suppose. Speaking of the kids themselves, I kind of found myself a bit annoyed at Salim and Kat because I kind of felt that they were just a little bit too uptight about social conventions in a way that was, again, sorry, not realistic. I worked in a daycare a few years ago and for quite a bit. And as somebody who has dealt with people who are on the autism spectrum, but also just normal kids, I find that like kids do have the capacity to be smart and emotionally intelligent and socially intelligent and socially aware. But at the end of the day, they're still kids. Like they're not fully grown adults that have all of the social like conventions down in their head as we do as adults. So I just found it a little bit weird that they were so concerned about Ted's own outbursts because, like, you know what, I think kids themselves don't have a complete grasp of social conventions yet. Considering the ages of the kids in the book itself, Salim and Kat I think are 14 and Ted are 12. So I don't know, like I feel like it felt a little weird that they would be such enforcers of social rules when I feel like kids in real life are not as much. But I guess that's kind of like the source of conflict between the three, like them being like, Ted, don't say that. But I don't know, I feel like if like a normal kid would just say the things that Ted says and an adult would be like, ugh, kids, am I right? You know what I mean? Like I don't know, I definitely didn't know how I feel about that. The answer to the mystery itself was quite obvious. I kind of clocked it in the beginning of the story, but it's appropriate for its targeted audience. Sandra, the assistant to Gloria, was a very glaringly obvious suspect, but having her work with an accomplice was quite a surprise. So I think even I didn't see that coming, especially because they did the classic it was the friend all along vibe. Overall, I like this book. I would recommend it not just for the story, but also for its capacity to show children what it might be like for somebody who is on the autism spectrum. I'm definitely not claiming myself to be an expert on these things, by the way. Just because I've got a brother and I've worked with kids on the autism spectrum doesn't mean that I am an expert on these things. But I, as a person who has worked with kids on the autism spectrum and a person who lives and takes care of somebody on the autism spectrum, I felt that the representation here was at the very least not harmful. Like, I think Ted had a lot of agency and is given a lot of opportunities to be emotionally mature and is given a lot of space to grow as a person, which I found was quite good for this kind of story in a way that can be understood by children, of course. I mean, I appreciated it. I wouldn't say I'm an expert. And I would be interested to see what other people who are on the spectrum actually think about this particular book. I think you should definitely seek out what autistic people actually feel and think about media that is written about them instead of me, if that makes sense. So yeah, I gave it 3 stars on Goodreads because I thought it was okay. And I guess that's all I've got for today. I'll see you guys in my next video. All my social media links are down in the description, as well as my Ko-fi and Patreon page if you guys want to support what I do. Press the like button if you enjoyed watching this video, and subscribe if you want to see more of my work. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye!